Imagine being watched every single day of your life. Every conversation, every decision, every step. Imagine never being allowed to walk alone, never being allowed to choose your own friends, never being trusted to make your own decisions. For most people, that would feel like a prison. For a young girl named Victoria, it was simply everyday life, long before she became one of the most powerful women in history. Victoria was a lonely child. She lived inside Kensington Palace in London. The palace was large, beautiful, and filled with luxury, but for Victoria, it often felt cold and empty. She had servants, she had teachers, she had guards, yet she had very few friends and almost no freedom. What made her situation even harder was that she had never known her father. When Victoria was only 8 months old, her father died. She was too young to remember him, too young to understand what had happened. All she knew was that something important was missing from her life. As the years passed, her world became smaller instead of larger. Her mother and a powerful advisor named Sir John Conroy controlled nearly everything she did. They believed they were protecting her. Victoria believed they were controlling her. Every day followed strict rules. She could not meet people freely. She could not go anywhere alone. Even at home, someone was almost always beside her, watching, listening, guiding, deciding. The system became so strict that it earned a name. People called it the Kensington system, and Victoria hated it. She felt trapped. She felt lonely. Most of all, she dreamed of one thing, freedom. But Victoria did not spend her days complaining. Instead, she learned, she read books, she studied languages, she practiced drawing, and every day, she wrote in her diary. Those pages revealed a young girl who was intelligent, determined, and quietly ambitious. A girl who believed life could be different. A girl who hoped that one day she would finally be allowed to make her own choices. She did not know it yet, but that day was coming. And when it arrived, it would change not only her life, it would change the history of an empire. On the morning of June 20, 1837, Victoria was sleeping peacefully. She was only 18 years old, still young, still inexperienced, still trying to understand her place in the world. She had no idea that history was already knocking at her door. Before sunrise, servants rushed through the palace. Important visitors had arrived. The situation was urgent. Victoria was awakened and asked to get dressed quickly. Something serious had happened. A few moments later, 2 senior officials entered the room. Their faces were solemn. Their voices were quiet. Then they delivered the news. King William IV was dead. Victoria listened carefully. For a moment, the room seemed completely silent. The old king was gone, and because he had no surviving children, the crown now passed to the next person in line. That person was Victoria. At just 18 years old, she had become Queen of the United Kingdom. The lonely girl from Kensington Palace was now one of the most powerful people in the world. Most people would have been terrified. Many expected Victoria to panic. Some expected her to cry. Others assumed she would be overwhelmed. Instead, she surprised everyone. She remained calm. She stood tall. And she quietly said, 4 simple words, "I will be good." Those words were not dramatic. They were not emotional. But they revealed something important about her character. Victoria understood the weight of responsibility. She knew millions of people would now look to her for leadership, and she was determined to do her best. Later that same day, she attended her first meeting as queen. The room was filled with experienced politicians. Most were much older than she was. Many had spent decades in government. Some were uncertain about the country's new ruler. After all, she was only a teenager, but Victoria quickly changed their minds. She listened carefully. She asked thoughtful questions. She spoke with confidence. The men who expected a frightened young girl found someone very different. They found a queen Perhaps the greatest change happened after the meeting. For the first time in her life, Victoria could make her own decisions. She no longer needed permission for every action. She no longer lived under the strict control of the Kensington system. The freedom she had dreamed about for years had finally arrived. Yet freedom came with a price. Because being queen meant carrying responsibilities few people could imagine. Every decision mattered, every mistake mattered, and every choice could affect millions of lives. Victoria had spent her childhood dreaming about freedom. Now she was about to discover that freedom and responsibility often travel together, and soon another person would enter her life, a person who would bring her happiness she had never known before. His name was Albert. For the first time in her life, Victoria was free. She was queen. She lived in Buckingham Palace. She made her own decisions, and she no longer had to live under the strict control that had shaped her childhood. Yet despite her new power, something was still missing. Victoria was surrounded by advisors, ministers, servants, guards, but she often felt alone. Being queen could be surprisingly lonely. Very few people understood the pressure she carried. Very few people saw the person behind the crown. Then, in 1839, someone entered her life. His name was Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. Albert was Victoria's cousin, but he was very different from many of the men she had met at court. He was thoughtful, intelligent, quiet. He loved music. He loved science. He loved learning. Most importantly, he treated Victoria as a person, not simply as a queen. When they spent time together, Victoria felt comfortable. She felt understood. She felt happy. After one of their meetings, she opened her diary and wrote about him. Her words revealed a young woman deeply impressed by the prince. She admired his character, his kindness, his intelligence, and slowly, those feelings became something more. Victoria fell in love. There was one unusual detail about royal life. A queen could not wait for a proposal because she outranked everyone else. She had to ask first, so Victoria made a bold decision. She proposed to Albert herself. Albert accepted, and on February 10, 1840, they were married. It was one of the happiest days of Victoria's life. The ceremony attracted enormous attention. People across Britain celebrated. For the first time, Victoria seemed truly complete, not because she was queen, but because she had found someone she trusted completely, someone who stood beside her, not behind her. Their marriage became a genuine partnership. Albert was not interested in taking Victoria's power. Instead, he helped her use it wisely. He became her closest advisor, her most trusted friend, and the person she relied on more than anyone else. Together, they built a family. Over the years, they would have 9 children. Their home was often filled with laughter, conversation, and activity. For Victoria, who had experienced such loneliness as a child, this meant everything. These were the happiest years of her life. She ruled a growing empire. She had a loving husband. She had children. She had purpose. And she had happiness. It seemed as though the difficult years were finally behind her. But history has a way of testing even the strongest people, and soon, Victoria would face a loss so devastating that it would change her forever. For many years, Victoria believed her happiness would last forever. She had Albert. She had her children. She had a country to lead, and she had finally found the sense of belonging she had searched for since childhood. Albert was more than her husband. He was her closest companion, the person she trusted most. Whenever she faced a difficult decision, she turned to him. Whenever she felt uncertain, he gave her confidence. Together, they faced the challenges of royal life as a team. But in 1861, everything changed. Albert became ill. At first, nobody seemed overly concerned. He was only 42 years old, still relatively young, still active, still working hard. Surely, he would recover. But as the weeks passed, his condition worsened. Victoria watched helplessly. She spent as much time with him as possible. She stayed near his bedside. She hoped, she prayed, she waited. But sometimes, hope is not enough. On December 14, 1861, Prince Albert died. The news shattered Victoria. The strongest relationship in her life was suddenly gone. The man who had stood beside her for more than 20 years had disappeared forever. She was devastated. Friends worried about her. Family worried about her. Even the nation worried about her. The Queen, who had once seemed so strong, now struggled with overwhelming grief. Days became difficult. Simple tasks felt impossible. The world that once seemed bright suddenly felt dark and empty. Victoria could not imagine life without Albert. For years afterward, she remained deeply attached to his memory. She wore black clothing almost every day. She kept Albert's rooms carefully maintained. His belongings remained where he had left them. It was as if part of her refused to accept that he was gone. People across Britain noticed the change. Many began calling her the widow of Windsor. Some sympathized with her sorrow. Others criticized her for withdrawing from public life. They wanted their queen to return, but grief does not follow a schedule. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be commanded. And Victoria's grief was profound. For a long time, she struggled to move forward. Yet, despite her heartbreak, she never completely abandoned her responsibilities. Slowly, very slowly, she continued working, she continued governing, she continued living. Not because the pain disappeared, but because she learned to carry it. That may have been the greatest lesson of Victoria's life. Strength is not the absence of sorrow. Strength is continuing despite sorrow. The years ahead would prove that lesson again and again, because although Albert was gone, Victoria's story was far from over. In fact, the most influential years of her reign were still ahead, and during those years, her empire would grow larger than ever before. After Albert's death, many people feared Victoria would never recover. The cheerful young queen was gone. The happy wife was gone. The woman who had once enjoyed public events and celebrations rarely appeared in public anymore. For a time, it seemed as though grief had become the center of her world. But history was moving forward, and whether Victoria felt ready or not, she still had a nation to lead. Slowly, she returned to her duties, not all at once, not dramatically, but step by step, year by year. The woman who had once depended heavily on Albert learned to rely on her own strength, and as Victoria continued her reign, Britain continued to grow. Factories expanded, railways spread across the country, new inventions transformed daily life. Cities became larger, trade increased, technology advanced. The world was changing faster than ever before. Victoria witnessed extraordinary developments during her lifetime. When she was born, travel was slow, communication was limited. Most people never traveled far from home. By the later years of her reign, trains connected cities, telegraphs carried messages across great distances, telephones began changing communication, electric lights appeared. The modern world was beginning to emerge, and Britain stood at the center of much of that transformation. The British Empire expanded across continents. Its influence reached North America, Africa, Asia, Australia, and countless islands around the globe. At its height, millions upon millions of people lived under British rule. People often said that the sun never set on the British Empire because somewhere in the world, the sun was always shining on British territory. Victoria became the symbol of that vast empire. In 1876, she received a new title, Empress of India. The title reflected Britain's growing influence and power. By then, Victoria was no longer simply a queen. She had become an institution, a symbol of stability, a symbol of continuity, a symbol of an entire era. In fact, historians would eventually give her reign a special name, the Victorian era. It was more than a period of time. It became a description of an age of industry, innovation, expansion, and enormous change. What made this achievement remarkable was that Victoria never seemed extraordinary in the traditional sense. She was not a great military commander. She was not a brilliant inventor. She was not a famous explorer. Instead, her strength came from something quieter: consistency, duty, persistence. She continued showing up, year after year, decade after decade, even after heartbreak, even after loss, even after countless challenges. The lonely girl who once dreamed of freedom had become one of the most powerful women in history. But time eventually reaches everyone, and as the 19th century drew to a close, Victoria entered the final chapter of her remarkable life. By the end of the 19th century, Queen Victoria had become something larger than a monarch. For many people, she represented an entire age. Generations had grown up, knowing no other ruler. Children had become adults, adults had become grandparents, and throughout those years, Victoria remained on the throne, steady, familiar, constant. The world around her had changed dramatically. When she was born, there were no railways connecting the nation, no telephones, no electric lights, no photographs in most homes. By the final years of her life, technology had transformed society. The pace of change was astonishing, yet Victoria remained a symbol of continuity, a bridge between two very different worlds. As she grew older, her health gradually weakened. The responsibilities of decades weighed heavily upon her. Many of the people she had once loved were gone. Friends, family members, political allies, on bewan. They disappeared from her life. But Victoria continued, just as she always had. In January 1901, her condition worsened. The Queen, who had survived heartbreak, political crises, and enormous change, was approaching the end of her journey. Family members gathered around her. They knew history was unfolding before their eyes. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died. She was 81 years old. Her reign had lasted more than 63 years. At the time, it was the longest reign in British history. News of her death spread quickly across the world. The reaction was extraordinary, not only in Britain, but across Europe, across Asia, across Africa, across the many territories connected to the British Empire. Millions mourned her passing. For many people, it felt as though an entire chapter of history had come to an end, and in many ways, it had. The Victorian era was over. A new century was beginning, a century that would bring new inventions, new leaders, new opportunities, and new challenges. Yet Victoria's influence did not disappear. Her legacy remained everywhere, in the institutions she helped strengthen, in the era that carried her name, and in the example she left behind. Because when people remembered Victoria, they did not remember a fearless warrior. They did not remember a brilliant conqueror. They remembered something different. A woman who endured, a woman who continued, a woman who remained steady through joy and sorrow alike. And perhaps that is why her story still matters today. Because most of us will never rule an empire, most of us will never wear a crown, but all of us will face hardship, all of us will experience loss, and all of us will be asked, at some point in life, to keep moving forward. Victoria's greatest achievement may not have been ruling half the world. It may have been learning how to continue when her heart was broken, and that lesson is timeless. More than 100 years have passed since Queen Victoria's death. The world she knew has disappeared. The British Empire no longer exists in the form it once did. Many countries have gained independence, new nations have emerged, and countless changes have reshaped the modern world. Yet Queen Victoria remains one of the most recognizable figures in history. Why? The answer is not simply because she was a queen. History has known many kings and queens. Most are eventually forgotten. Victoria was different. Part of the reason lies in the extraordinary length of her reign. For more than 63 years, she remained on the throne. Few rulers have governed for so long. Her reign connected generations. People were born, grew old, and died during the Victorian era. For many, Victoria seemed permanent, like a mountain standing quietly through changing seasons. But longevity alone does not create a legacy. Something deeper explains why people continue to remember her. Victoria's story reflects experiences that are universal. She experienced loneliness. She experienced love. She experienced loss. She experienced responsibility. And she experienced grief. These are not royal experiences. They are human experiences. That is why people still connect with her story today. Even though most of us will never live in a palace, even though most of us will never wear a crown, we understand what it means to lose someone we love. We understand what it means to face responsibilities we did not choose. We understand what it means to continue when life becomes difficult. Victoria's life reminds us that strength is not always loud. Sometimes, strength is quiet. Sometimes strength is simply getting up each morning and continuing. Another reason for her lasting influence is the era that bears her name. The Victorian era transformed Britain and influenced much of the world. Industry expanded, science advanced, technology accelerated, global connections increased. Many foundations of the modern world were built during those decades. As a result, Victoria became permanently linked to one of history's most important periods. Yet perhaps her greatest legacy was something far more personal. She showed that leadership does not always require extraordinary charisma. It does not always require military victories, and it does not always require dramatic speeches. Sometimes leadership means remaining steady when others lose hope. Sometimes leadership means carrying responsibility through years of uncertainty. And sometimes leadership means continuing despite heartbreak. That was Victoria's gift. Not perfection, not greatness in the traditional sense, but endurance, the ability to keep moving forward. And that may be why her story still resonates today. Because in the end, Queen Victoria's greatest victory was not ruling an empire. It was mastering herself. When people hear the name Queen Victoria, they often think about power. They think about palaces, crowns, empires, and history books. But if we look more closely, her story is really about something much simpler. It is a story about growth. Victoria was not born confident. She was not born powerful. She was not born free. In fact, much of her childhood was defined by restrictions. Other people made decisions for her. Other people controlled her future. And for many years, she felt trapped. Yet she refused to let those circumstances define her. Instead, she continued learning. She continued growing. And when opportunity finally arrived, she was ready. That lesson remains important today. Many people spend years waiting for the perfect moment, the perfect opportunity, the perfect situation. But Victoria reminds us that preparation often begins long before opportunity appears. Another lesson comes from her relationship with Albert. Their marriage was not important simply because they were royalty. It was important because it showed the value of partnership. Even the most powerful people need support. Even the strongest leaders need someone they can trust. Victoria achieved great things, but she never pretended she did everything alone. And when Albert died, she showed us another lesson, perhaps the most important lesson of all. Life will eventually bring loss. No one escapes that reality. No amount of power can prevent it. No amount of wealth can stop it. Victoria lost the person she loved most. The pain was real. The grief was overwhelming. Yet she continued. Not because she stopped loving him, not because she forgot him, but because life continued moving forward, and so did she. That may be the reason her story still inspires people more than a century later. Not because she ruled an empire, but because she faced the same struggles that all human beings face: loneliness, responsibility, love, loss, change, and uncertainty. Her life reminds us that courage is not always dramatic. Sometimes courage is quiet. Sometimes courage means taking one more step when you feel like stopping. Sometimes courage means continuing when nobody knows how difficult the journey has become. Victoria understood that, and perhaps that is why history still remembers her, not simply as a queen, but as a woman who endured. Queen Victoria's story began with a lonely little girl inside Kensington Palace. A girl who dreamed of freedom, a girl who wanted the chance to make her own choices. Over time, that girl became a queen, a wife, a mother, an empress, and one of the most influential women the world has ever known. She experienced extraordinary success. She experienced heartbreaking loss, and through it all, she continued moving forward. That is why her story remains powerful today, because it reminds us that strength is not measured by titles or crowns. Strength is measured by perseverance, by resilience, by the ability to continue when life becomes difficult. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Queen Victoria. If you enjoyed this story, please leave a comment and share your thoughts. What part of Victoria's life inspired you the most? And what lesson will you remember from her story? If you would like to continue improving your English through powerful stories from history, be sure to subscribe and join us again. Until next time, keep listening, keep learning, and keep moving forward. Even after her death, Queen Victoria's influence did not disappear. In some ways, it became even larger. During her lifetime, Victoria and Albert had 9 children. Those children married into royal families across Europe. Over time, their descendants spread throughout the continent. Kings, queens, princes, princess, many were connected to Victoria's family. That is why historians often call her the grandmother of Europe. Her family connections reached Germany, Russia, Norway, Sweden, Greece, Romania, and many other nations. Few people in history have influenced so many royal families, yet there is an irony in this story. The little girl who once felt lonely and isolated inside Kensington Palace eventually became the center of one of the largest royal family networks in history. The child who struggled